Thanks for the introduction. Like it was mentioned, my name is Ugur. I'm a technical product owner at API3, and we do something called first-party oracles, and my presentation today is going to be exactly about that, third-party versus first-party oracles. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about are more from an objective data approach, so under the assumption that there are data sources available that give access through, for instance, their APIs. So I typically like to start these presentations off with explaining what oracles are, but I presume this won't be necessary at this conference. So instead, I thought about starting off with some definitions in literature I found about what oracles are. So the first one being that blockchain oracles are third-party services that provide smart contracts with external information. The next one being that blockchain oracles are defined as trusted third-party services that send and verify the external information and submit it to smart contracts. And the third definition I found is a blockchain oracle is not the data source itself, but rather the layer that queries, verifies, and authenticates external data sources and then relays that information. So what I wanted to highlight here is these definitions. They have a very certain theme emerging: third-party services, trusted third-party service, not the data source itself. So in reality, or how this looks practically, is that you typically have a dApp. That dApp, for instance, wants the price of ETH against USD. We have an API somewhere, which could be an exchange like Binance, or an aggregator like CoinGecko or Keiko or various others. And in order for this dApp to consume said data, we need an oracle that actually brings that on-chain. So as we previously defined, or as the definitions I've shown you stated, there are certain implications that are being made here. Oracles and APIs are defined as being operated by different entities. So in such a construct, there typically exists some type of agreement between these entities. So an oracle provider would, for instance, need to pay for an API service to then relay that data on-chain, or in most cases even pay for the services and come to some type of agreement to be allowed to sell said data on the blockchain, because a lot of API providers actually have terms and conditions that forbid the resale of data. This might not be true for something like Binance, but this definitely becomes true for price aggregators like Keiko or whatnot. So if you look at the setup you see over there, you'll quickly realize that we left ourselves to a single third-party setup, so a single third-party oracle. So the natural way people looked at this is we need to reduce the reliance of one single oracle, which we do by simply adding multiple oracles to this into the middle. So each of these would provide you with the value you want, and these get aggregated in some form before being made available to a dApp. So what we did here is essentially to minimize trust that we introduced with a third party, we introduced more third parties. And however, despite the fact that we introduced those third parties, we're still depending on a single data source. So naturally, you'd want to make sure that your oracles actually get data from multiple sources so that like one source cannot simply rug you. And even in the best case would be that the oracles are actually using multiple APIs and are also not only relying on a single source. But the harsh reality actually is that today data sourcing is kept completely out of the scope for most Oracle projects. In most cases, you consume a price feed and you know which oracles you get your data from, but you typically have no idea where that oracle gets their data from, which creates a little bit of a trust issue, because how can we confirm that, for instance, this setup or the previous setups are not like a single source, because you're not telling us where the data comes from. But all of these have something in common, which is this middle layer that I described. So you have multiple oracles in the middle, and they use one or hopefully multiple APIs. So when you have two separate entities involved. And this comes with certain issues. The first one I wanted to talk about is the middleman tax. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's always some type of agreement between Oracle node operator and API provider in type of monetary aspects. So they pay for it, or there's some type of agreement, which technically means that effectively these oracles, aside from gas costs that already exists, have a cost basis they need to cover. They paid for data, they need to make money, so it's worth it. So the service essentially becomes more expensive than it technically needs to be. So how do we pay for the service? It either gets rolled on to the users, so the users pay for feeds that are more expensive than they technically need to be, or token subsidies. So essentially, the oracles get subsidized, so they do the work they're supposed to do, and the users still have cheap feeds. Another aspect I wanted to touch upon is decentralization. Data being served by multiple oracles doesn't make a feed decentralized. The only thing adding multiple nodes in such a constellation does is solve the problem that was introduced by third parties in the first place. So we're trying to minimize trust implications that we put on a single party. And most of the times we can't even effectively do this because we can't determine source level decentralization. There is no transparency about where all of these oracles get their data from. And the third point is, no matter how we actually spin it, the introduction of middlemen introduces more entities that we need to trust. And we put significant efforts into game theory, and game theory, into minimizing that trust. We talk about essentially staking and slashing models, reputation-based systems that claim security because of potential future profits, and many other models. But what it essentially boils down to is that we're trying to optimize for a middleman layer that we could, in theory, remove altogether. So I want to go back to the definitions we had before. Third-party services, trusted third-party services, not the data source itself. But what if these two separate entities are actually one of the same? What if our oracle is the API and the API is the oracle? And whenever I make this statement, people typically like to say, isn't this centralized? And what I have to say to that is yes and no. So the on-chain delivery method, whether that is through first-party oracles or through third-party oracles, actually has no influence if your data sourcing is centralized or decentralized. Little example about that. So on the right side, over there, you see, one sec. On there, you see, or let's start on the left side. Here you see data being sourced from a single source, and what you're left with is essentially that the centralization is obfuscated because they're making use of 3 oracles, but they still rely on a single source. And the issue, I'm not even sure if we should call it an issue, with first-party oracles is that they automatically and directly create transparency. So if you look at this constellation on the right, you're suddenly left with one source, and everybody automatically thinks this is centralized, but it's technically left and right the same thing that you're consuming as a consumer of data. Another thing I wanted to talk about is that the delivery method, whether it's first party or third party, also has no influence on your ability to aggregate data. You can aggregate 3 APIs that are served by 3 third-party oracles, or you can aggregate 3 first-party oracles. The result from a source-level decentralization is exactly the same. From a source-level decentralization, there's also no difference, and even adding, for instance, 2 more oracles here doesn't make your feed more decentralized. And I again wanted to bring to your attention that in most cases these things cannot even be determined because we simply do not know how these third-party setups are getting their data. So there are certain advantages that using first parties So the first one being that by removing middlemen, we are actually removing additional layers of trust. So in the process, we also remove the middleman tax. If you look, for instance, if you have a data feed of 30 third parties and they get their data from 10 APIs, you suddenly build a construct that relies on 40 people. So in some way or another, 40 people need to make money here. Whereas if you would only use the data sources, you suddenly eliminated 30 people of this entire process. Additionally, it creates full transparency, which specifically has been an issue for a lot of institutions with the current solutions. So most of the enterprises we at API3 are in touch with always come to us and say they need to know about the entire value chain of the data that they consume. So simply saying it comes from this Oracle network is not really a solution for them, because at some point there's like a gap in the data. There's no way for them to clarify where it actually comes from. And the last point I wanted to go into is actually that it also adds composability. So a lot of, for instance, price feeds that we currently consume are one-size-fits-all solutions. You get a Bitcoin price feed, it has 30 oracles, and if you're lucky, you know how many APIs are behind it. But you don't really have the possibility to build something that fits your data needs. You can't define which oracles are used in an aggregation, and you definitely cannot define which APIs each oracle should be using. Why is this important? If you look back a couple of months, I'm pretty sure some of you remember the day where CoinMarketCap kind of went crazy and showed Bitcoin at 400 trillion and ETH at 300 trillion, stablecoins at millions of value. So that wouldn't have been an issue, but CoinMarketCap is actually used by some of these, or by most of these projects, I even want to say. And this only became evident because if you looked during the event onto the data websites everybody has set up, you saw outliers reporting billions of values. Obviously, these didn't make their way onto chain because they have been detected as outliers or the aggregation method prevented it from happening, but that was the first glimpse you had into how third parties are actually sourcing their data. With first-party oracles, you could, in theory, aggregate and specifically include sources you trust and essentially exclude sources you don't. If you don't trust CoinMarketCap since that incident, there is no way for you to remove it currently. So obviously, this begs the question, why aren't data sources running our sources currently? Where are the first-party oracles? And I want to say there are certain limitations that currently exist that prevent most of the API businesses out there to actually run their own oracles. The first one being, and I think that is the most major one, dealing with cryptocurrencies. You have transaction costs, you need to pay for gas. A lot of the payments are made in crypto, and some projects even require you to acquire a stake in their native token to actually operate their Oracle node. And a lot of these businesses, may it be for accounting, legal reasons, or whatnot, simply cannot touch crypto. I think we're 5 to 10 years away until we can actually ask them to do this actively, but the current state doesn't allow it. The market entry costs for such enterprises are simply too high. So even though we're currently working on ways to make it as easy as possible to run oracles, most of our efforts are actually going into optimizing for middlemen and large enterprises, like for instance, you heard T-Systems and AP. These are really big players that have a small division that can deal with this. But the reality of things is that most API businesses around the world, you're often dealing with very small groups of people that are very specialized in a certain field of data. And these businesses simply don't have the capability, may it be technical, legal, monetary, or simply their size, to deal with operating and making data available on-chain. So I think that these aspects are what's keeping most of the API businesses today out there from operating their own Oracle nodes, despite the fact that we actually have massive demand for data on-chain. And my personal opinion on this is that we need to essentially bring these entry costs down by breaking down complexity, so much that it becomes essentially a no-brainer for every API provider to provide their data and make it available on-chain. I'm not sure if a lot of you are following essentially APIs on Web 2. There are various marketplaces where an API provider can literally deploy in minutes. And they don't need to do anything. They just go onto the website, paste their API specs into it, and they're suddenly available. And I think we need to get to that point where they can simply do this without actually knowing anything about crypto, without actually knowing anything about the underlying blockchain, or it gets broken down and abstracted away so much that it doesn't matter to them. So I think in this process, the ultimate goal should be to minimize trust. There was a panel yesterday that made a pretty good point about the fact that using oracles already implies trusting somebody to some extent. And this extent can be broken down or greatly minimized if we break down complexity and remove technically unnecessary participants. Like I mentioned, so far most of our middleware is optimized to be operated by middlemen. And my suggestion or more hope is that in the future we start to optimize middleware for data sources instead. I know that a lot of this sounds controversial, and I'm not of the opinion that there's one right approach of doing this. But our current approach seems to ignore that data essentially originates from somewhere. And if those entities have the ability to monetize this themselves at some point, they will do so. And that's it.